everybody, and welcome back to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, and not just any fantasy today.
I came in hot early.
You came in hot.
This time, I was just excited that you were also ready to talk some fantasy with me.
Right.
I wasn't ready to wait for the, not just any fantasy today comment.
Yes. We're all very excited and raring to go today because we're doing a fantasy book recommendations series today. It's been a while since we've done one. We've had so many books to read and to talk about, which is a great thing. But now that we've got some time, an exciting thing happened in the world of fantasy literature, internet culture in the month of April, and we're so excited to talk about it, and we figured, why don't we frame the whole conversation around it through a book recommendation series. Today we are going to be talking about the Our Fantasy 2023 Book Bingo Challenge.
Yeah, I've done this challenge before, but I should probably explain what it actually is. Mm-hmm. Basically, Our Fantasy, which is a subreddit of, fantasy fans everywhere for kind of stuff that we cover here. It's hugely popular, this subreddit. I'm trying to check 3 million plus members, Charles. At this very moment, 1,261 people are scrolling it.
Nice.
So this is a huge subreddit. It's a big part of the fantasy community, and they release every year a bingo board that has 25 spots, if I'm correct. That's how many are on a bingo board, right, Charles?
Yes.
5 rows of 5.
Mm-hmm.
And each spot has its own type of book or category of book. Mm-hmm. And the goal, ideally, is to read 25 books, each fitting one of these categories. You could, of course, just go for the bingo, go 5 across or diagonal or horizontal. Mm-hmm. So you could, or across and horizontal are the same. Vertical is another option in bingo. I'm great at bingo. So I know how many spots there are. I know how to win. But ideally, people like to try to fill the whole bingo board here. So an example of a category on the bingo board might be superheroes, which is one this year. So it's as simple as read a book that has superheroes in it, and then you get to cross that off your bingo board. So over here, our goal is to help you all find great books that fit into those categories. If you're a user of the Our Fantasy bingo board, then of course you can apply any of these to the appropriate category. If you're not a user of the Our Fantasy bingo board, you can just take this as a general recommendations episode where we're going to be going through a lot of books because we've got multiple books for pretty much all of these categories that you can take. And if if the idea of reading a book that involves, let's say, set in the Middle East / Middle Eastern sci-fi fantasy, if that appeals to you, then you got a great rec for that.
You sure do.
As you will for 24 other spots. So
that's right.
Yeah. I also want to mention, while I'm doing this long rambling at the top, that we do not have a very active presence on Reddit in general, or Our Fantasy in particular. So it's kind of upsetting that we might not be able to really disseminate this to folks on there. You're not really supposed to self-promote on there unless you're already a pretty active user, like friend of the show Mark Lawrence. He's on there all the time, and he throws in the occasional self-promotion. They don't mind that. But us, if we just come in hot out of nowhere and be like, hey, listen to our episode, that's not going to fly.
Nope.
But you, wonderful listeners, if you have a presence on our fantasy, you can promote us all you want. So we would absolutely love, if you enjoy this episode, that you post it to our fantasy and let folks know, because we hope that this would be a fantastic resource where folks can help figure out what they're going to read to fill out those bingo boards.
Well said, Dylan. And yeah, but even, just listening, as we always say, is more than enough. We'll put the
not
link.
this time, Charles.
Dylan's after that.
This
Reddit
time you
karma,
have to
that
promote
sweet,
it.
sweet karma.
Yeah.
So
Once karma's involved, just listening is no longer more than
and hey, if
enough.
you're the first one to post, you could reap all the karma potentially. So, it's a timing thing
There could
too.
be anywhere from 10 to 15 upvotes.
Yeah. So that's, that's pretty sweet karma for people like us. So something to consider. But
I do have one post on there from like when we first started that was... it was something about Denna that actually picked up decent steam. I don't know if you remember that.
I do. And I remember I commented on a Witcher thing at one point back in the day. It's always fun. Always fun. But we spend so much of our free time talking about fantasy stuff that we don't get to dabble in our fantasy as much as we want to. So this is kind of our way of doing both today, because I'm a big I've never done the challenge, and we're not about to start the challenge officially on the show or anything like that, but I'm sure we'll get pretty close.
Nor unofficially.
Yeah, no. we'll get pretty close, I'm sure, because the bingo period lasts, it started April 1st and it goes through March 31st of 2024. So we've got a full year here. I'm sure we'll get pretty close to completing this indirectly, but either way, I think it's a fun thing. What I like is that it encourages people to step outside of their comfort zone, read something truly new. And it also, for me, it kind of like highlights, like by some of these categories, and we'll get more into this as we go through the categories, it interestingly highlights like trends or areas for opportunity within the fantasy genre, depending on how easy or challenging some of these categories are. So I like it for that too. It kind of helps me recontextualize the what's going on in the world of fantasy sometimes with some of these categories. So looking forward to getting into that. But above all, we're going to do a lot of really fun book recommendations today. So hopefully, even if you're not playing along on our fantasy, you can still find something you like. And the bingo card is on the our fantasy page too. Again, we'll have the link in the description. I'm going to make a note to include that so you can check out the post yourself. You can contribute your read along progress and submit it to our fantasy too. And just definitely consider going to check that out if you've never done it before, and at least check out the bingo card and try and read some of these categories you may not have considered reading before. It's always good to broaden your fantasy horizons.
I should note that if the rules have not changed since I did it, you have to use a different author for every spot.
Oh,
so this was, Charles was getting at how this is a great way to expand your...
Oh yeah, it says you may not repeat an author on the card, except you may reuse an author from the short story square. Okay.
That's fair. So you cannot repeat authors. This was a great way for me when I did it many books. Moons ago that I was the kind of reader for a long time where I'd pick up a series by a particular author. Let's say I pick up Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, and I'd read that first book. Okay. Next, I read book 2 in that series. Next, I read book 3 in that series. And if I really like the author, I might just start moving through all the rest of their stuff. So you go on a little Brandon Sanderson kick or whatever there. And then when I did this bingo board, I was reading all sorts of authors that from all sorts of backgrounds, reading all kinds of different books that I was like, I think I'm going to read more like this moving forward. So it was actually a game changer for me. And then since we've started the show, I think we've kind of moved more toward that model of reading lately. We used to go straight through series, and now we'll pop around to make sure that we're getting the diversity we want.
Sure.
And reader, this is reader. Yeah,
Listener,
you're a reader if you're
reader,
listening to this. Yeah,
that.
sure. You have the opportunity to expand your reading horizons as well. But shall we, with no further ado, Charles?
No further
start
ado.
Getting into this bingo board?
Yeah, let's start with the first row. We're going to go tile by tile here, so you don't need any kind of reference because we'll describe each one. So let's get into it with the first row, square number 1, and the category is title with a title. And this feels like a free, like a gimme, basically, because there's just so many books. But the description is, read a book in which the novel title contains a job title, military title, or title of nobility, such as locksmith, lieutenant, or lord. This title can be something that is bestowed upon a character, such as hero, and it can include fictional titles that are only in the setting, such as Legend Born by Tracy Deonn. So this is the hard mode is not a title of royalty, and we made a very long list for this one, so I guess we can kind of just shout out a couple, but they all have titles in them, and some are, plenty of them are within the hard mode where they're not royalty, so tons to go through here. You want to shout out a few?
Sure. And this one we have a ton of Rex because how will we ever find a fantasy book with a title in the title?
Pretty much every
so
fantasy
we
book,
won't go into
nouns
great
is a
detail.
title.
Right. We won't go into great detail on any of them, but some of the ones where we have less Rex, we might get a little bit deeper into. But I'm just gonna string these off, and maybe we'll touch on a couple if we want to. The Black Tongue Thief by Christopher Buehlman. God, that was so good. Very fun.
Very good.
Last Argument of Kings by Joe Abercrombie. The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien. Never heard of that guy, but
just had to throw it in there.
Deep cut. deep cut. Jeez. So Charles, you did put in a couple of third books in here. The Burning God is the next one, also a third book. So in case folks have read the first two in those series,
well, you'll see that there's some of these that kind of could, like the first book could count, and the second book could count, and the third book could count. So you could theoretically read a series, although authors don't count.
No, you can't. You can't, Charles.
Oh, man. That's interesting. So that's something to consider.
But in case you're 2 books into any of those series, you can pick up the third.
If you finish 2 in March of this year and they don't count for the read along, and now you're in April, May, and finish it for sure.
That's true. And the next few are all first books or standalones.
Right.
The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson, fantastic novella. Red Sister by friend of the show Mark Lawrence.
Sister being like a title about a nun, by the way, just so you know. It's like
I kind of went through the process and I was like, what is Sister? And I was like, oh yeah, Sister is the title of the nun. So that's fair, Charles. A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin. King, that's so good, Charles. So good.
It's a good
and that's
one.
some old school fantasy for you. Ursula K. Le Guin on the Mount Rushmore for us.
Certainly.
When it comes to fantasy authors. Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. The Way of Kings by one Brandon Sanderson. Prince of Thorns by Mark Lawrence. Again,
Lawrence had a lot of titles in his works, so it was fun to include a bunch of those.
I like these. Lawrence is all over our Rex.
Oh yeah, you're going to see a lot of them coming up. But he's written a lot of stuff and a very diverse catalog as well. He always writes something completely different from the thing he wrote before. So there's a lot to recommend. And big fan of the show. Yeah, big topic in the interview. Good shout out. Good mention to that. Yeah, that was relatively recently.
Check out.
Yeah, for sure.
The Magicians by Lev Grossman.
Love that one,
Charles. When are we going to get to that on the show?
I've pitched it before. Question. We got to get to it soon because I feel like that has been swept under the rug, and like the SEO has just been overshadowed by the sci-fi show, which is such a crime because the books are just so good. I've never really given this show a chance beyond when we tried to watch the first couple episodes and bailed immediately. At the time it like aired, like we watched the premiere because we had read the books and we were like, not for us. And we moved on.
Oh, we sat down. So The Magicians, for those who don't know it got turned into this TV show on Sci-Fi they really tried to lean into this like adult edgy Harry Potter aspect of it, which is not, to me, the point of the like the books. The Magicians are like really psychological. They dive into some of the like more mundane aspects of like studying to become a magician, dive into depression, all that kind of stuff, but not in like the edgy, sexy way, in the like more realistic way. Fantastic books. And then we sat down to watch a show. Me, Charles, his twin brother Chris, and his dad. Right, we were all sitting in the living room in your old house, and by the end, it was just me and Charles. And so we were not, and we didn't even love it.
Like, we just watched like we read Chris these books together. We were had so much fun talking about them. This was before there was any podcast to which we could share. And then there's like, "Whoa, they're making a show. We got to check it out." And we powered through.
Yeah, but, your dad was out of there at about the 18-minute mark, and Chris maybe made it 30 minutes. So we made it all the way through the first couple episodes, but it just wasn't for us. Love the books, though.
Books are phenomenal. Definitely check out The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And my last rec on this list, which I think gets bonus points because it's 2 titles, Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb. So you got the title. The efficiency of title to, words in the title is at maximum. So that could be a good one.
Right. You don't even have to delve into the second letter of the alphabet when it comes to which letters you start with, too. It's just very efficient to read Assassin's Apprentice by Robin Hobb.
Beautifully said. So that's the first square. Let's move right along into the second square. I didn't have much to contribute on this one, but I remembered you had read something that kind of qualifies. The second square in the first row is Superheroes, which is story focuses on superpowered individuals, heroes and villains and capes, and the hard mode is not related to DC or Marvel. So Dylan, what do you got for us here?
Steelheart by Brandon Sanderson, first in the Reckoners series. And this is, I always pitch it as if Brandon Sanderson wrote The Boys by, which is, that graphic novel that got turned into a TV show over on Amazon Prime. Obviously, some of the most notable aspects of The Boys are the more like grotesque, R-rated,
explicit content
stuff. Yeah, but the premise of The Boys and the premise of Steelheart is very similar, which is what if the superheroes, quote unquote superheroes, were all pretty messed up people and really more resembled villains than they did heroes. And then the other side of it is what if like people without powers tried to fight back against these superhero/villains. And it's kind of like young adult feeling. It's just absolute Brandon Sanderson delivering on entertainment, which is when I think he is at his best. So I highly recommend this whole series, really.
Yeah, when you described it, I immediately put it on my TBR because I'm a huge fan of The Boys, obviously, huge fan of Brandon Sanderson. So that stuck with me when you had talked about it in one of our earlier book recommendation episodes around Brandon Sanderson. And I was like, man, I didn't even know this existed. So I gotta dive into that. He releases so much. It's hard to keep track of what's where. You're so used to his like Cosmere or another Mistborn novel and this and that, which I guess is also Cosmere. And this is a departure from that. So I'm curious to see.
Yes, not Cosmere.
Yeah, so curious to see Sanderson outside that. I didn't have much to contribute here because to me it felt more like, I don't know if graphic novels count in this. I feel like maybe they do. Some of my favorite non-DC or Marvel superheroes are Invincible, Jupiter's Legacy, One Punch Man. Just throw those out there, but not sure if they count. So we'll stick with Steelheart for now and move on to square number 3, which is bottom of the TBR. This is to be read. As I just mentioned, I added Steelheart to mine. These are books that you make a mental note to read at some point in the near future. Or read one of the books that's been on your to be read pile the longest. If you do not keep a TBR, read one of the books that you have been meaning to read for the longest time but haven't yet. And there is no hard mode for this.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because it's hard for us to give a recommendation to you all of what is at the bottom of your TBR. Yes. But we can give you examples of kind of the thought process of each of us put one book on here and why, or I put a whole series that I could select.
You put multiple
series I could select from, but it's by the same author.
Right.
And you kind of put in the thought process behind why you said The Once and Future King by T.H. White, Charles.
Way to take my recommendation away from me, Dylan.
No, I'm saying, why did you select that?
You took the route. No, I'm just kidding.
Reveal is a huge reveal that you want to read, like King Arthur's story.
Yeah, well, it's been on my TBR for years because, this comes back to our conversation around The Magicians. I was such a huge fan, and I was doing a lot of research into Lev Grossman at the time because I was so impressed. And one of his big influences was The Once and Future King, by T.H. White, and I made a note of it, and then I've seen it in bookstores, and he actually, Lev Grossman has a little blurb on the front cover of a lot of the reprinted versions of The Once and Future King. So I'm man, I gotta check this out, and I just never have because it's a bit on the older side. Originally published in 1958, you get this collection of fantasy novels loosely based on King Arthur, and you're like, yeah, I'll get to that eventually. And we read so many books. I'm not usually one to have a book on my TBR and then never read it, and then people start a whole movement on social media to get me to read it, and I still don't read it. That's not the kind of person I am today. I've read so much of the past year has been committed to cleaning up my TBR that we're kind of getting down to, I've famously read The Lies of Locke Lamora, of course, is what I'm referring to there. Famously on my TBR for a decade that I finally read. I read N.K. Jemison's The Fifth Season, which has been on my book ranks for forever. I just finished Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which had also the Stormlight Archive, all of these huge books that were at the very bottom of my TBR for years. So this is kind of the last one left, really, and everything else is relatively new for me. So this would be definitely the main book that qualifies for me. And if I guess you're a more old school fantasy fan, if you like King Arthur, if you liked Lev Grossman's The Magicians and you want to see some of his main influences, which is the reason why it's on my TBR, then we should check it out together. That's the reason why it is on my TBR and why I had to put it on the square, Dylan. But you've got, of course, I've been pushing the Night Angel trilogy or the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks for a very long time for you to get to read those, especially considering you're such a fan of the grimdark genre.
Yeah, for me, it's just that author, Brent Weeks, that I have no idea why I have not read any work by him. I feel like this might make you, hopefully, listener, think of who's that author that you're like, why have I not picked up a book by this person? Because it seems like his work is right up my alley, right? Yeah. It's grimdark. I love grimdark. It's got rogues, right, Charles? At least one of those series has rogues.
Oh, yeah.
And it is action-packed. I hear the comparisons to Mistborn, one of my favorite books.
That's how I read it. The natural next step from a Mistborn or a Prince of Thorns or something.
Yeah. Is great magic system as well, right? Mm-hmm. So I know all of these things about the series, and I feel like I should read a book, and it's I don't know why I haven't. We should read it at some point very soon on the show. I think it's time. So I'm inviting you to bring it back to FPF, or maybe we should just Friends Pitching Fantasy, that is, where we pitch books to each other, and the other selects one out of 3 books that were pitched to be one of our next reads.
Yep.
And I don't know. I don't know what's happening there, Charles. I have to read a book by Brent Weeks.
Yeah, this one is like such a natural progression for you, especially from like me coming from what I know you like in a fantasy story. I'm like, this checks all of the boxes, and the fact that it's been as long as it has been that you haven't read anything. I mean, I can't really talk. I've only read the Night Angel trilogy, so I'm only 3 books up on you, but I'm told that the Lightbringer series is like some of his best work, and that's a relatively recent series as well. So a lot to dive into here from Brent Weeks, especially for you fans of the grimdark genre, or from like these harder fun magic systems a la Mistborn. Like there's definitely a lot to enjoy with the Brent Weeks series. And I have my FPF next time whenever we do it. I have my 3 recommendations in mind, and one of them is Brent Weeks. So I'm glad you put this here, because it's been one of the things I was going to pitch for forever. So yeah, that's good to see. And then I think that brings us to square number 4 on the top row, which is magical realism or literary fantasy. And this is a book that portrays magical or unreal elements in an otherwise realistic or mundane environment. These books are often found on literary fiction shelves and book lists, and not always shelved as genre fiction. This is a hard square to pin down, as what makes something literary or magical can often come down to vibes, so use your best judgment. Not saying a Game of Thrones is literary fiction, since there aren't a lot of magical elements. Check out this thread, blah, blah, blah. Hard mode, not one of the 30 books in the linked thread, which I'm not going to check the linked thread, but I have to, when I read this description, I was like, they're literally describing the exact setting of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, which takes place like during the Napoleonic Wars in England, and magic exists, but like English socialite culture and bureaucracy is so like, they're satirizing it, right? So it's so like boring and so bureaucratic that no one really cares. So there's only 2 magicians that can actually practice magic in the world, and most of them are theoretical, like historian, like knowledge-based magicians. They still get the title, but they've never done magic in their whole life. They're just scholars. And it is exactly this. It's legitimate magic in a very mundane environment of ye old England, and it's presented that way as a satire. So I had to put that on here, and that was my recommendation. I had nothing else to contribute to this. I was like, this is the rec, this is the genre, like read this and be done.
I definitely see that, Charles. When I first saw this square, I was like, what? I don't know what even would go on here. And then I saw you put Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I was like, oh, that's perfect. I wonder if Babel, the recently published book by R.F. Kuang, would probably fit this square as well. I do think it's kind of gone into this more literary mode as it's become this #1 New York Times bestseller. It seems like it's transcended just genre fiction, and it's also considered to be a tonal response to Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So we've done episodes that are entirely dedicated to both of those books, like 2 separate episodes, one for Jonathan Strange and one for Babel, where we give spoiler-free reviews of those. So I highly recommend you check those out if you're thinking about either of those books. I also, then I started thinking, like, okay, these are on, they're kind of fantasy, but then they get shelved as if they're more the just capital L literature. And I'm looking at then Station 11 and Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel. I would say both those don't really get put in the fantasy section all the time. Station 11 is her pandemic book that predated the pandemic. And and that I read right before the pandemic, and definitely did not make me spiral at all as I saw the pandemic approaching, but it got made into an HBO miniseries recently that was very well loved, as is the book. Sea of Tranquility is an interesting book with some hopping across time that takes place. It's got stuff as early as I think it's early 1900s or late 1800s, all the way through, like, we're dealing with a moon colony hundreds of years from now. So that one's fun, but it's also got these more literary vibes to it. I also put Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which is a book that made me cry. It's got these existential elements to it. Another one that I don't usually see shelved in the fantasy section. Another one that got made into a movie that I did not like. So,
as it typically happens with these adaptations, you know, it's always a gamble.
And then I put this is more of a question than necessarily a recommendation.
I see this on the list. It's a good question.
Right? So can you put legitimate classic, capital L classic literature? Capital L classic literature? Can you say that?
Yeah.
Capital C, capital L classic literature.
Oh, yeah.
How about that?
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Because I put Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which I read recently, and I'm like, this is as literary fantasy can get, right? And it's got a person who makes a monster. It's just not something you would normally think of as fantasy, but I feel like that's what this category is, right?
Yeah, I mean, it does at the end of the day, according to the thread, the post, comes down to vibes and use your best judgment. And the animation of Frankenstein is could be considered a fantastical unreal element, or otherwise in an otherwise realistic mundane environment. And I think that's a big part of the theme of the story. It's like when society's confronted with something they don't understand, it's scary, and they develop a mob mentality and try to destroy it and this and that. So yeah, I'd say why not? Spoiler alert for Frankenstein.
You could also do well, the original Frankenstein doesn't have as many of those mob elements. I found out after I read it, like the 1818 version of it or whatever. It's interesting. It's a lot of like what happens when you try to play God and the hubris of that. There's the old expression that I have no idea who said it and just gets attributed to random people. Like one of those Abraham Lincoln said, never trust anything on the internet type moments. And but the quote is great.
Most noted for saying.
Yeah, the quote is great, which is, I believe, knowledge is knowing that Frankenstein is not the monster, but wisdom is knowing that Frankenstein is the monster. Because Frankenstein is not the name of the actual monster.
No.
That's Frankenstein's monster.
Yes.
Dr. Frankenstein is Frankenstein. So it's some of this, like, who's the real monster type themes that play into it. I don't know. It's a great book, actually. It's like I've been trying to delve more into classic literature, and this has been probably my favorite that I've read of some of these like way old books.
Maybe we should talk about ye old fantasy books someday. I don't know, a dedicated episode at some point. But for now, Frankenstein. There's also another category.
Like Dracula could fit.
Dracula. There's some Charles Dickens stuff you could throw in there.
Yeah. Capital C, capital L classic literature stuff could fit. This category, then there's all sorts of choices
that's true
actually make a lot of sense.
Yeah, and
anyway,
when you're limited to one author per square, it could be a good way to kind of hit that without delving into the more popular, prolific authors and kind of burning them on a square like this. So for sure. So that brings us to the final square in the first row, and we'll be a fifth of the way through here. That is young adult. Read a book.
34 minutes into the episode, we're a fifth of the way through.
We will get a little faster. We'll do this one quick because everyone knows what young adult is. Read a book that was written for young adults, hard mode, published in the last 5 years. The two I came up with were two that I have not read and would actually read for this square, but you have read them and talked about them on the show at length, and that is Skyward by Brandon Sanderson and Half a King by Joe Abercrombie. Now, if I was playing the game, I'd probably end up reading Brandon Sanderson's superhero book for that superhero square, which would eliminate him from being able to count for anything else. So I would read Half a King by Joe Abercrombie because I love Joe Abercrombie and I want to read everything that he's written. And after reading all the First Law content, this is all that's left is this young adult series. So I would dive right into it, cross it off, and but both books are high up on my young adult TBR Yeah, that leaves the last book here that I see you typed in here, which is an interesting addition. Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Six of Crows series by Leigh Bardugo. That's Rogues, and it's actually got some of these Lies of Locke Lamora type elements to it. It's got a heist story element to it. It's also part of the now Netflix series that got made from Leigh Bardugo's work. So check that out.
Big Netflix show also, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So anyway, Skyward by Brandon Sanderson, sci-fi, young adult Sanderson. It's got a great main character that I really like. Half a King by Joe Abercrombie is very Joe Abercrombie while being young adult, it's just interesting for fans of Abercrombie to see what happens when Abercrombie tries to write young adult.
Filter himself a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting, but for me, First Law Universe is way better, but Half a King is certainly worth the read. I enjoyed the whole series.
Well said, Dylan. Let's jump into the second row here. Square number 6. We've got Mundane Jobs. I see you didn't add anything to this, so I'll just read the description and then jump into my 2 here. This is the protagonist has a commonplace job that can be found in the real world, so no princes or monster hunters. We are also excluding...
There are princes in the real world.
I know,
They
right?
go around writing books and whining about how hard their prince lives are.
That's a good point, Dylan. But it's probably not a mundane job, I would say. It's probably got a little bit of excitement attached to it.
Well, I don't know. They're always insisting how much they're just like us. So maybe it is mundane.
Something tells me that's not the case. And we are trying to expedite some of these squares here. So I'll just go through this a little faster. We are also excluding soldiers as they're already extremely prominent in science fiction and fantasy. Hard mode does not take place on Earth. So I have 2. The one we just read, so I won't go into it other than to say highly recommended and check out our episode. That is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune.
So good.
The main character, Linus Baker, works as a case agent for a company that investigates orphanages. He's a caseworker, basically. And a whole part of the beginning is how mundane his job is. He takes the bus. He sits at the desk. He's doing a lot of grunt work. He's got the manager, the extremely upper management. It's all part of it. So highly recommend for the square.
Perfect,
the other
Rick.
one, thank you, is The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett. Now, I'll be honest with you, I read this a million years ago. Don't fully remember it. But I do remember there was a sketch about the guys selling insurance, and the magical creatures were like, insurance? That was the joke. So... I think that counts. So if you've never read Terry Pratchett,
read The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J.
There's other
Klune
categories you may want to read for this one. So consider Terry Pratchett's Color of Magic. I just wanted to include 2 in case you need to move some of these authors and books around to cover other squares. So, and we'll get more into that soon. But the next one is published in the 2000s. Read a book that was published between 2000 and 2009. And the hard mode is not on the Our Fantasy's Best 2023 list, which I didn't really look at.
Best of 2023?
Yeah, but there's like old books in
it's like
that,
the
like
list
the all
of
time
this year.
best.
Okay.
Yeah. So,
that makes sense.
Which can change with the times, but this one was hard for me because I didn't readily know like which ones exactly met the cutoff of 2000 to 2009. But I do know this was like glory days of grimdark. Like Game of Thrones was already super popular, and now people were writing like the grimdark genre at its best. So you get things
but it's also got a lot of these like I don't know. I see this as having produced a lot of modern classics.
Yeah. Well, now you're in
are
like,
beloved
this
by
is
you and me.
in classics territory for sure. There's a lot of titans in this list, and Dylan, I see that the one at the very top. I think we don't need to give it a full like recommendation or review or anything, but I think it's important to remember this was published in the 2000s, and if you haven't read it, read it for this square.
The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, maybe my favorite book. I like when I stop and think like that varies over time, but the beautiful prose of Patrick Rothfuss, the wonderful, the wonderful story starring Quoth and and my favorite character, Dana, in this wonderful novel. We've talked about it at so much length.
Ad nauseum,
we'll get into
one
the
could say.
Yeah.
So
True.
check out all of our Patrick Rothfuss episodes, of which there are many. Enjoy our conversation on that. Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, book 1 of Mistborn, also in this time period. Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, another huge classic that I have read.
Tentpole.
Yeah, tentpole. American Gods by Neil Gaiman, if you want something a little less grim, dark, swords and sorcery. I threw that in there to spice it up. The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie, are you kidding me? Definitely. Come on. Yeah. Quintessential 2000s fantasy right there. And Red Wolf Conspiracy. Shout out to Robert V.S. Reddick. Got to put his name out there. We did a lovely read along with him. So if you haven't read those books.
And there's an episode before that where we kind of talk about the read along in the series.
Spoiler free.
I think that would be spoiler free, a great option.
Because so many of these are super popular that if you are a fantasy reader, you probably read all these other ones. So this might be a deeper cut pick for some people. So it's read Name of the Wind, read The Blade Itself. It's you don't need to tell me to read that, okay? This is when people recommend 2 fantasy books, one of these is probably in it. So you yeah, I think I'm glad you included that, a little bit deeper cut.
Yeah, in this, I want to pick a book that to me defined being around that time and how I was just getting into adult fantasy around then, and this one was one of the first that I read. So, and we love Robert and his work.
Yeah, super nice guy, huge creative talent and force. Definitely check out that work.
The things that he comes up with, it's how does any human come up with that?
I asked myself that the whole time I was interviewing him. I was like, what?
What goes on in your brain in the best way possible?
I was how do you even think of this is beyond me. So, but yeah, very talented author there. And then now we move on to square number 8 on the second row. Angels and Demons. Story must feature angels or demons or both in a prominent role. This was hard, and it's how I came up with the only thing, which may be too obvious for a lot of people, is Good Omens by Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett, which actually stars an angel and a demon together, co-starring it. So
it's a perfect rec if you haven't read it.
But almost too perfect because a lot of people have already read it. So it's what happens if you've already read this book? Good luck. I don't know. But it's because what you consider, you may have to have a more liberal interpretation of straight up what an angel or a demon is.
I was does House in the Cerulean Sea work for this because Lucy is the son of the devil?
Yeah.
It's a demon. I don't even really know the distinction between
that for
demons
this square.
And devils.
I would.
I think it would count for sure. They're pretty liberal with what counts for these squares, so I don't think anyone would.
And could you say certain monsters from is a vampire a demon? I don't know. It's like a monster from The Witcher, a demon. I don't know.
Something in The Witcher has to be a demon.
Something in The Witcher has to be a demon.
Isn't there a daemon? Or what they believe is a daemon. Yeah. I don't know if a daemon is different from a demon.
Right.
I don't think anyone's going to police you on any of these, so
Me neither. So let's move this right along then to square number 9. 5 SFF short stories. Any short science fiction or fantasy story, as long as there are 5 of them. Hard mode, read an entire anthology or collection. So we've talked about a bunch of these before. Sharp Ends by Joe Abercrombie. We did a 2-parter on that. Maybe one.
Wow, we did a 2-parter.
I believe we did. We recorded it in New York. Remember?
We liked the deep dive.
Yep. Road Brothers, Tales from the Broken Empire by Mark Lawrence. Obviously, I know a lot of people have read The Broken Empire, and we always say don't sleep on Road Brothers. So if you have, this would be a great opportunity.
It's not a bed.
It is not a bed. The Paper Menagerie and Other Short Stories by Ken Liu. I mean, it's in the title. And then there's a couple here that you put, Dylan, that I'm not familiar with, but any of those are great recs. the Ken Liu one, I've only read The Paper Menagerie, and I loved it and would definitely read his other works. A bit more contemporary and not as much like swords and sorcery medieval setting.
Leans capital L literary.
Capital L,
I wonder if
more
reading
like Chicken
The
Soup
Paper
for the Soul
Menagerie and
kind
other
of stuff.
yeah, The Paper Menagerie and other stories, I would view that as something that you could probably read for the literary fantasy as well. It's
That's a good point. Yeah,
absolutely brilliant, and that would probably be my top rec.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Those stories. There's also During the Dance by Mark Lawrence is an incredible short story
you have
that
to read
you can
5
read for
though.
free. Yeah.
But that could be one of them, and then you could read a
Mix all these
couple
up.
Ken Liu ones. Yeah, mix them, read a
Sure.
sharp ends, mix and match.
Oh yeah, no, I'm saying, if you have The Paper Menagerie and other stories, you could read one from that. Then you could read During
That's
the
true,
Dance.
that's true,
And
that's
you
true.
could pick up, During the Dance by Lawrence is available for free on his website, and super short and emotional, and you'll see the range that we're talking about when it comes to Lawrence's work. It's hard to believe it's by the same person who wrote the like Broken Empire with Prince of Thorns and stuff. Then Rogues Anthology by George R.R. Martin and Gardner. I'm going to butcher this. Dozois. Dozois?
Dozois?
Get a little French?
Oh, a little
Dozois?
French, a little French action.
Dozois?
Dozois?
Either way.
Dozoi?
Rogues and-
Dozois? Yeah, I don't know.
Definitely not that one. So, Rogues Anthology, if you're a big fan of rogues like me, and you've heard of this George R.R. Martin fellow, those are the editors. It's an anthology that has stories by little-known authors like Patrick Rothfuss, Joe Abercrombie. And I believe George R.R. Martin contributes to it as well as.
And keep in mind, this is
also,
the square where
Scott
you can
Lynch.
repeat authors. This is the only square you
Yes.
can do that. So go crazy.
Scott Lynch, who knows his way around writing rogues, and he
I've
does
heard of him
write
before.
a wonderful short story in there that does not actually include the gang of thieves from the wonderful Lies of Locke Lamora. So you get a little bit of Scott Lynch variety in there.
Nice.
There's a lot of good stuff, and of course many other works by other authors, some of which you might not be familiar with, so you might find your new favorite author.
So if you've kind of been sticking to the heavy hitter Mount Rushmore types, this would be a good one to continue down that path and still not, burn an author on another square. So that's a good rec for sure. The next one is horror, which read a book from the horror genre, which does it still have to be fantasy adjacent at that point? I'm assuming yes. I see you didn't add any to my list, so I'll just run through these super quickly. Now, the first 2 recs are ones that I have not read, but I feel confident recommending them because of the author. Of course, we all know Christopher Buehlman from The Black Tongue Thief. We did an episode on it. We already recommended it earlier in this episode, but he's originally, a horror author, and he has 2 books that are particularly well received in the horror genre. That is Those Across the River, or his other book, Between Two Fires. So that is probably, I would read one of those for my horror square for sure, because I was such a huge fan of Black Tongue Thief and his style that I would dive into the horror. And honestly, the Black Tongue Thief has definitely some horror elements, so I'm afraid to see what he considers really horror, I'm sure
Capital
it gets
H horror.
Yes, capital H. I'm sure it gets very extreme just from the scenes that we read in Black Tongue Thief. I'd already be like, that's intense, man. What are you capable of? So that I would be confident in. The other 2, we all love Neil Gaiman. He wrote a more young adult horror story called Coraline, which I love.
Great movie.
I
haven't read the book.
The
but
book
I love
is
the movie.
fantastic, and the movie's fantastic. Super good story. Probably my favorite Neil Gaiman work, if I'm being honest. Coraline, highly recommend. And the other one is not fantasy at all, but it is a horror book. It's one of my favorites, Red Dragon by Thomas Harris. You may know The Silence of the Lambs, famous movie. This is first, like Silence of the Lambs is technically the second book in this trilogy of books featuring Hannibal Lecter, and Red Dragon is the first one. It's honestly the better book, which is interesting because The Silence of the Lambs is the better movie, but there you go. Fantastic book, great pacing,
movie.
Very beginnings of the whole like procedural forensic criminal profiling kind of genre. It was really at the forefront of all of that, and it's super interesting. There's great reveals, like there's a great like we call, Sanderson has his Sanderlanche. There's great Avalanche reveal moments in this book, and highly recommend. Really interesting characters too, so highly recommend that book. It's not fantasy adjacent at all, but it says
the Harris Cane.
Yeah, the Harris Storm, the Harris Lanch. So read a book from the horror genre is all it says. Hard mode, not Stephen King or H.P. Lovecraft. So read, if you can get away with reading,
you could read those though.
You could read those.
You could. I would recommend It by Stephen King. Had I because you gotta let me finish. So. We talk about Mr. Miller from time to time.
We are approaching, we're only on the second row.
Aren't we now? So sometimes I do have to.
Speed is not your strong suit.
You should see me on the tennis court, though.
That's true.
And now, I would recommend It by Stephen King. Had I read it, I did. We had this assignment, Charles. It was the one where Mr. Miller got really into footnotes. You remember we got really into
I remember
footnotes?
when you picked the book and you had it on your desk and it's massive. And I'm like, this guy's not reading this. He's just not reading it. Could he have picked a bigger book?
Yeah, when I first picked it, I was like, I want to read some Stephen King. I did not know the page length. And I end up being like, I can't read this book. Especially because I procrastinate when it comes to homework assignments, especially back then. So then I wrote the paper, the big essay with all the footnotes that Mr. Miller was like, you have to have like 10 footnotes or whatever, because he got convinced that was super important for succeeding in college. And then I wrote the essay based on the Wikipedia summary, not for the book, because that didn't exist back then, but for the movie. And this is the old movie. Did pretty well in the assignment, though. I'm assuming Mr. Miller had not read it either.
Well, no way. So definitely not like recommending that one for sure. But isn't it crazy that I have memories of us like in high school and you pulling out it and putting it on your desk in high school? We're so flipping old, man. It's crazy.
Yeah, that was a long time ago now.
A lot of history.
Charles is older than me, though.
Yeah, by like a couple months. But anyway, that gets us out of the horror and into the third row, guys, over halfway. This one is a really important square, real fun square. Self-published or indie publisher. If the novel's been picked up by a publisher, it only counts for this challenge if you read it when it was still self-published. And then the hard mode is fewer than 100 ratings on Goodreads, or an indie publisher that has done an AMA with Our Fantasy, which I did not track either of those things. My big one is Daughter of Flood and Fury by Levi Jacobs, friend of the show. Had him on a couple times. Stories told in the first person. It's a shorter read, faster read, but great characterization, great action sequences.
Present tense as well.
Present tense as well, yeah. Really good, really ambitious novel. Finalist in the Self-Published Fantasy Blog Off. Shout out to Mark Lawrence again. Or at least a contender. I don't remember how it placed, but
it was a finalist.
Okay, good.
Yeah, great for fans of Mistborn by Sanderson. Jacobs has a lot of Sanderson influence in his work, and also fits the young adult square. I recommended The Innerlands, something. Oh, and yeah, I wholeheartedly second the recommendation of Daughter of Flood and Fury. If that wasn't clear, The Innerland, Something Stirs by A.J. Austin is another one that I recommended here. I read it when I was a judge in SPIFBO. It was my pick to get through to the semifinals, And it's a great, very personal, psychological kind of story, but it does have stakes, kind of these like looming, almost White Walker feeling stakes to it. Legacy of the Bright Wash by Crystal Matar. Neither of us has read this, but this has been just an absolute phenom on the Twitter sphere, and Crystal is super nice. So want to throw that one in there. And even though I haven't read it, I feel super confident that you will enjoy it because everyone else does. Shall we move to set in the Middle East? Middle Eastern SFF, Charles?
We shall. And the category is described as read a book that is set in the Middle East or in an analogous setting that is based on the real-world Middle Eastern settings, myths, and cultures. See these pages from intros on which countries and regions qualify, which we will not do. Example novels would include, and they recommend a bunch of stuff, which we won't get into, but we can get into our recommendation, of course. We've recommended this book a bunch of times, which is The Final Strife by Sara El-Arifi, and the setting has a strong Arabian influence to it. And we're reading The Battle Drum right now, and it kind of even expands that even more in the second book. And if I was going to recommend one series for this square, it would be Sara's Final Strife for sure.
Yeah, I totally agree, Charles. What a fantastic book, and a recent one. And you'll see a lot of the Arabian influence in that series.
For sure.
I mean, we interviewed Sara and got into much greater detail on this one, so check that out. It's one of my favorite interviews that we've done.
Yes, me too. That was a great one, and we'll just move right along to our next category, and that is published in 2023. No reprints or new editions. Hard mode is that it's also a debut novel. This was an interesting one. I don't think we have any debut novels in this list, but we have The Battle Drum, which is book 2 of the Ending Fire trilogy by Sara El-Arifi, book 1 being The Final Strife. We have The Book That Wouldn't Burn by Mark Lawrence, which comes out, maybe it's already out at this point, but it comes out in May, which is very exciting. And Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee, which just came out as well. So huge releases this year. I think these are the ones that we're like most looking forward to and have come out, and that's why they're on our list for published in 2023. Big authors here, big names.
Yep, Battle Drum definitely picks up with where the Final Strife left off with a banger of a sequel, Charles, and we know we can count on.
You went there.
Yeah, how I did. And Mark Lawrence, Fonda Lee, we know we can count on anything that comes out from them. Shall we move on to Multiverse and Alternate Realities?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. Read a book in which the setting contains at least 2 universes, dimensions, planes, realities, etc. that characters within the book can travel between. Multiple worlds in the same physical plane of existence, such as planets within a universe, would not count for this square. Hard mode is characters do not walk through a literal door in order to get to another world. And they're, of course, referencing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis, which we put on the list just for funsies. The other one I would highly recommend is Heroes Die by Matthew Stover, which I would count
fantastic
as
an for this
alternate reality because it's like a sci-fi setting, and he puts on the headset like Gladiator style, broadcasts his adventures in a fantasy setting to spectators that kind of experience his video game protagonist like fantasy, like if he was a Skyrim character and we could just plug in and be him doing cool action stuff. And that's the setting for that book. Love that book. That one I forgot when I was making my my Friends Pitching Fantasy. I forgot about this one because I've been dying to read this one on the show ever since we started the show too. So great rec for this one. Clears the hard mode qualifier. That's probably my top rec for this.
A fantastic top rec, Charles. I love that book as well. You've been a champion of that book.
Mm-hmm.
It is grimdark before grimdark really picked up. It's so ahead of its time. Wow. And I remember also it delivers an extremely satisfying conclusion, which you just don't get enough of. And
great sword fight in there, like really talented stuff going on. Another one that I'll recommend, and Dylan, can I read your your note on this one?
Don't read it word for word, but yeah. I believe that this author
I don't think
has
they
had
are.
a lot of...
There's a lot of controversy around this author, so I'm going to recommend this, and I'm doing air quotes, okay? Because
this is not Dylan approved.
This is not FTF seal of approval here, but it qualifies, and I think it's worth reading to look back and see how far the fantasy genre has come. I am referring to Blue Adept by Piers Anthony. Now, I have a relationship with Piers Anthony's books that I think a lot of people do, where they read them when they were younger, loved them, and then look back and you're like, oh yeah, it's kind of like watching an old movie that you loved and they make a lot of weird jokes that would probably get them canceled today, that kind of stuff. And you look back on it and you're like, yeah, this was, when you think of like what was wrong with the fantasy genre, or like what people are writing against, like what modern authors are trying to do for the fantasy genre that they were complaining about in the past, you can see that stuff bubble up pretty frequently in Piers Anthony's work. But it is a similar story in which there is a sci-fi world and a fantasy world, and the main character kind of bounces between the two, but it's the depiction of women that gets him a lot of slack, and we don't sanction him on the show,
especially
for sure.
Very young women, I believe, Charles. I think that there's a lot of...
There is sort of some of that. I mean, he has one of his books is
maybe
literally
not in this
called
book.
Like, it's got panties.
The color
in the title.
of her panties.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's literally one of his books, and it's very pulp fantasy. Like the guy wrote like 1 million books, right? A la like Dragon Riders of Pern, but that was written, This was written very male gazy, I will say. But I think, it's sometimes if you're someone who's big into the fantasy genre and you're reading books for like historical context, like if you're reading a book just to see where fantasy was and why it is what it is today, like I remember reading and enjoying these books, and I think it's made me have a better understanding of the fantasy trajectory as a genre, and so I'd recommend it from that level. But otherwise, if you want to just read a good book for a square, read Heroes Die by Matthew Stover. Don't read this. But if you're curious, and I think a lot of people have fun reading it to kind of be like, what were people think? Like fantasy was wild back then, like that's kind of a reason people pick it up. But yeah, not necessarily a recommendation, just an acknowledgement that it exists and qualifies for the square. And I don't think you're going to be reading Piers Anthony or other squares.
According to Wikipedia, critics note that he frequently defends pedophilia in books like Bio of a Space Tyrant and Firefly.
Yeah,
so
I don't think
may want to stay away.
I don't think that we're well equipped in research to... I'm not defending him.
I just said according to Wikipedia.
Yeah.
Which we know, according to Mr. Price, our high school social studies teacher, is not an appropriate source, but it might be accurate. Yeah. So I don't know a lot. I've not
there's an interesting conversation to be had. I'm not supporting him at all. It's just, I find his existence fascinating because so many people are like, oh yeah, I love those books. And then you're like, oh wait, maybe I don't love those books. So it's just one of those things that...
Wikipedia is like harsh on their framing.
I think that was an overly...
I mean, maybe they're accurate.
Because you could have a character who's like, oh yeah, well in ye old times they got married at 16, and I describe her bosom in detail and this and that, and you're like, oh yeah, like. But then I could see someone being like, he defends pedophilia, like the P word big time, So I don't want to. You have that conversation, but I do. That's why we don't recommend him. He's a bit problematic to a lot of people, but it's worth reading and forming your own opinion on if you're a diehard fantasy historian.
Find it at a used bookstore.
Yeah, borrow it at the library or something. Or maybe not. You don't want that record.
Oh, God.
Yeah, so
all right, well,
we need to go fast here.
Let's go to books that we'll just cruise through these.
We spent way too much time talking about Piers
Anthony. Let's go to way too much. You could have not put it at all, but
it fits the category so perfectly, though.
We've got author must be person of color. We've got fantastic recs for this. Final Strife by Sarah El Arifi, The Fifth Season or The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin.
Which qualifies
The
for
Rage
hard
of
mode,
Dragons
which is a
by-
futuristic sci-fi world, by the way, The City We Became. That's why it's on there.
Nice.
Continue.
Did I say The Rage of Dragons by Evan Winter, which we're reading right now. The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez, who Charles absolutely loved that one.
Fantastic.
And I have not read it yet, but I look forward to one day. Jade City by Fonda Lee. The Poppy War or Babel by R.F. Kuang. And The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong.
Great books.
Any of those,
a lot of these you'll see come up in other squares because they're all fantastic. And this list could go on and on and on. Definitely as we move away from Piers Anthony Times, we get more diverse authors and diverse voices, and those stories become better. So we're super happy for all these authors, and we've read them all, loved them all. So you would not be missed checking out any of those. Let's move right along. This category was a little weird. We're on the fourth row now. Square number 16, a book club or read-along book. And they get a little bit of
Don't read this whole description,
promotion
Charles.
here. I'm not, but basically our fantasy has their own clubs and just read a book in the club. And so I was like, I don't know how to recommend stories for these. So I looked at them and I picked the one that I would join. And I would, if I had to do one of these, it would be the Steve Erickson read along group. And that's because I feel like I've tried to give Malazan a chance a bunch of times. And I feel like that one could be improved through like a read-along group experience, just to be like pick people's brains and just see where we're at and get bigger context and stuff like that. So that's all I'll say there is the Steve Erickson read-along group is the one I would recommend, but you'll have to go to the our fantasy books clubs list, and if you really wanted to cross this square off, see what you could do there. But that's it for that. Let's go to number 17, novella. Read a work of fiction between 17.5 and 40K words. Hard mode novella is not published by Tor.com Publishing, which we did not check on these. So we got Emperor's Soul, which we've already talked about. Edge Dancer is another one for any of you that have read the Stormlight Archive but not read Edge Dancer. It takes place between books 2 and 3, I believe.
You're going to run out of your Sanderson spot pretty quick if you take our Rex here.
You know, all the ones we've recommended kind of are pretty popular, except maybe like, I don't know. But maybe if you've read every Sanderson book and you kind of skip on the like book 2.5 short story thing, maybe this is your chance to like cross that off. Slow Regard of Silent Things.
Speaking of books 2.5, Charles.
Oh, here we go.
We have The Slow Regard of Silent Things by Patrick Rothfuss. Wonderful prose, whimsical, but nothing happens, and that makes some people mad. But Untethered Sky, I love it.
I love it too.
I'll read anything by Rothfuss. Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee. Again, haven't read that one yet, but it's Fonda Lee, so we feel confident. This is How You Lose the Time War by Amal El-Matar and Max Gladstone. I talked about that one in detail in a recent episode, spoiler free, but it's fantastic sci-fi novella that won a bunch of awards.
Sci-fi novella, I agree. And we did a whole episode on it where Dylan talked about it, and we got a lot of good chatter from that one, so I was proud of that episode. Dylan did a very good job. And that brings us to square number 18, Mythical Beasts. Read a book that prominently features at least one mythical beast, meaning a creature that doesn't exist in reality. Thank you, Dylan. I appreciate that. Although I don't know if they qualify for hard mode, which is no dragons or dragon-like creatures, but that's okay because there's some
very hard.
It's very, very hard. If there was like, do you consider like Game of Thrones like a dire wolf? But those, I don't know. There's dragons.
There might be dragons in Game of Thrones.
There might be.
But
anyway, here's my Rex. The Shadow of the Gods by John Gwynne. This is a relatively new release too.
So good.
And one of the reasons we love it so much is because it was like, creatures are underrated in the fantasy genre and modern fantasy these days. Everyone's so grimdark and self-tortured and this and that. But when did we stop having fun with all these creatures? So Shadow of the Gods is a great example of that. And of course, the cover is a big, beautiful dragon, of course, but it is a gorgeous cover.
Not going to hit hard mode.
It is a celebration of mythical beasts.
Can't even get to page 1
as well. Yeah, you can't even get past the cover.
Hard mode.
Right,
you
exactly.
can't get past the cover.
The next one is
The
Last Witch, which could also technically qualify for your short stories square. I'm just realizing that now. It's the first, technically, chronologically, of all the Witcher things out there. It's called The Last Witch. It's a collection of short stories. A lot of them used to inspire the show on Netflix by Andrei Sapkowski. I don't think there's dragons in this book. I think it's the Sword of Destiny that has the dragon one.
You are correct, Charles.
So I
feel
think
pretty
you
confident.
could get away with hard mode on The Last Witch. And honestly,
so.
It's the best book that The Witcher's entire catalog has to offer. So if you've always considered it, it's number 1, where you should start anyway. Number 2, the best work. Number 3, it qualifies. There's no dragons or dragon-like creatures. So that's a good one. As well as Shadow of the Gods, Dragon Riders of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, which we talked about.
No dragons in that one.
Definitely not. Definitely if you want older school fantasy, one of that pulp kind of series, there's a million books to read in there, and they're all pretty good. I read one recently on the show. The Chatham Voyage series, that's a great one by Robert V.S. Freddick. I don't know if I want to speak to that super
starting
quick.
with
We've already
the Red
talked
Wolf
about
Conspiracy. Yeah,
from a
fantastic.
creature standpoint.
And I would say it fits hard mode, especially the first book.
Yeah, I would say so too.
Yeah, fantastic story about folks who are, it's on a sea voyage on this giant ship trying to take a girl across there to marry an enemy, like to make peace and all that kind of stuff. But the hijinks and shenanigans and really intense world-threatening events as well all make this an extremely good recommendation.
For sure.
And I would say I'm trying to think which monsters occur in which books, but I'm pretty confident in the Red Wolf Conspiracy you at least will deal with some.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna say go. Wouldn't that be sad if I recommended that and I just couldn't remember what was in the Red Wolf Conspiracy? It turns out there are no
there's definitely
or monsters.
The creatures that are like the borrower style, like the smaller. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And then there's enchanted creatures and things like that.
Yeah. It counts.
It counts.
I'm going to say it counts.
So let's move on to square number 19 here. Elemental magic. The primary magic within the world deals with classical elements: earth, wind, water, and fire. Hard mode, not 2 very specific books that we're not going to mention because we are recommending The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wong. This is often compared to, if you love Avatar's magic system, you'll love the Sword of Kaigen, and for good reason. It's very action-based, magic system where they can control water, and there's other tribes that can control other elements, but really fantastic book, originally self-published. Winner of the self-published Spiffbo, right? The Fantasy Blog Off, I believe it was a winner.
It was the year that Levi Jacobs.
This book, if you read it, it could check off one of 6 different squares for you. It's got so many other things going for it, and we've already mentioned it in other lists. So I'll just move right along because that's the only one we have on that list. Go to number 20, Myths and Retellings. This was also a weird one. Read a book that is based on a myth or pre-existing story. Hard mode, not Greek or Roman mythology. I know there's that one that lots of people love that's YA, that's based on Greek mythology. That is, I could technically read that for this square because what is the name of it? It's super popular. There's people screaming right now. There's a super popular YA series. If you type in fantasy YA Greek mythology, it'll come right up. I'm sure.
Is it definitely YA?
Yeah. It's interesting. Shadow of the Gods comes up, which I have not
are you talking about the Song of Achilles?
No,
by Madeline Miller.
What am I thinking of?
That one's big.
Isn't it Percy Jackson and the Olympians? Isn't that
that's the one you're?
I think so.
What you're referring to? Percy Jackson?
Maybe. I don't know.
That would count.
The Achilles. The Lightning Thief.
Is it based on a myth, or does it just include mythological?
I think that counts, right? If it includes Zeus or something, it's got to count, right? So there was those.
Zeus is in the mix.
The one, Zeus is in the mix. It counts. Always counts when Zeus. I think that's what it says. Myths and retellings. Read a book that's based on myth or pre-existing story, or Zeus is in the mix. So There we go.
Yes, hard mode. Zeus is not in the mix because it's not Greek or Roman mythology.
But here's the two we have. Weird Sisters by Terry Pratchett, which is kind of a stretch, but it is based on elements of Shakespeare, specifically Macbeth and Hamlet. So to me, that would count. And, Terry Pratchett's Discworld stuff, you don't have to read in order. And here's one that you suggested, Dylan, that I didn't consider because I never read it, but I know you did. Or did you read it? And it totally makes sense.
I did read
for
it.
This. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is actually a perfect rec with no question that it fits. The Square. Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik, who's a Hugo Award winner, if I'm correct, for the book you read, Uprooted. It's a Rumpelstiltskin retelling. And Charles gets to see on our document
in the mix.
We made... Yeah, once Rumpelstiltskin's in the mix, it counts for myths and retellings.
Yeah, for sure.
It is. I don't know. It actually was not a great fit for my taste, if I'm being honest.
But that's what this challenge is supposed to do: broaden the horizons, let you dabble in something.
I believe this retelling thing was on the original bingo board that I did, and that's why I read Spinning Silver. And then I was like, you know what? I would have read that otherwise. I'm not really like a huge Rumpelstiltskin guy. I know there's a lot of you out there who are, but it definitely counts, and people love this book.
Naomi Novik, Hugo Award-winning author of Uprooted, which I believe
I thought I'd love it.
An appearance, yeah, that's fair.
Yeah,
totally fair.
Anyway,
moving right along.
I just thought of. Just quick, A Court of Thorns and Roses by the massively popular Sarah J. Maas. It is supposed to be a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and you don't need me to go into detail about like work by one of the biggest selling authors in the world right now.
Well said, well said. And that brings us to the fifth and final row here. 5 more categories to go. This one, square number 21, Queer Norm Setting. A book in a world where queerness is normalized, accepted, and prevalent within communities. Characters are not othered, ostracized, or particularly remarkable in any way for their queerness. Hard mode, not a futuristic setting. Yeah, to me, House in the Cerulean Sea, because we just read it, is a great example of this. The main character, Lioness Baker, is in the LGBT community, but it's not a big deal at all. There's a romantic relationship that just is so natural and accepted and normalized in the story. It's not about that at all,
right?
Necessarily.
And he has a neighbor who's just like, "Oh, I should hook you up with my nephew or whatever." Like, there's no point in that book that I remember him facing any sort of discrimination.
No, and that TJ Klune, in his author bio, even he's self-described as trying to normalize this whole queer norm. Kind of is a piece of what he's trying to accomplish with his writing in a lot of aspects, especially with this book. So great rec there. The Spirit Cuts Through Water by Simon Jimenez is another book I read recently that fits this perfectly. Again, there's a relationship, a queer relationship in this story that's just super normal. It does take place in a more fantasy vibes world, think Avatar, if it was super depressing and violent, is kind of where this setting is.
And Charles talks in detail about that one in a spoiler-free episode as well.
Sure do. The Final Strife by Sara El-Arifi is another one. You have you have people taking hormones and things, and it's supernatural, different pronouns and things like that, supernatural. There's a LGBT relationship at the very forefront of it, polyamory, the whole gambit is in here. So very cool.
Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse is another one that has non-binary characters that no one is discriminating against them for that in any way.
The fifth season also has characters that are like that too.
Oh, you're right. Yeah. You're right. Fifth season would fit for this one too. Black Sun's fantastic book with awesome characters. Highly recommend that one. Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon is another one that comes up a lot if you're going to search for something with a queer norm setting. And it's got honestly, this book was another one that was not my absolute favorite.
Right.
But it's hugely popular, and we do. Hannah came on from our pod, if I'm correct, to talk about the Priory of the Orange Tree. With me primarily. You were there, Charles.
I was listening, yeah, but I was the audience.
Just listening was more than enough, Charles.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
But that one definitely fits this category, and lots of people love it. It's also a behemoth of a book. It wasn't even that I didn't like it. It's more I didn't like it enough to justify how big a book it is.
And what's interesting,
I could have read a lot of smaller books.
What's interesting too is how the number of recs we were able to have for this particular square has just exploded for us in the past year. Like 4 of these books came out like this year, or like within the past 3 years. It's definitely like a super popular, fast growing.
And Black Sun might fit in that too, by the way. If you're saying 4, it might be all 5 that we just recommended.
Yeah, so it's really good to see. It's definitely, and that's why I like considering fantasy in these categories, because some are a little bit harder, some are a little bit easier, and that's pretty cool. So really interesting to see that.
Black Sun was
lots of great books in this category, though. Oh, 2020. There you go. So all relative in the past.
So you do see how far we've moved past the Piers Anthony.
Yes, we've moved past it both
in this episode and in terms of chronological time.
And the fantasy genre is better off because of it. And that brings us into category number 20. Square number 22 of 25. Coastal or island setting. A story features a major setting that is near or surrounded by the sea. And how could you not suggest The House in the Cerulean Sea? Again, this one you should just read, because
we've recommended all of these for previous squares.
The Wizard of Earthsea takes place on an archipelago, right? Like just a bunch of small islands. Red Wolf Conspiracy, thank you, by the way, takes place in a ship. One of the best, most interesting, unique settings in a fantasy book I've ever read. So Red Wolf Conspiracy, check that one out. That has to count, right? When like the setting is a ship, it's got to count. Even though it says coastal or island,
they land on
Coast.
places.
Yeah,
they land on places that involve the coast. They're
very seafaring
on the coast before they get on the ship. It's got to count.
And then The Lies of Locke Lamora.
Again, they're not persnickety.
No, they're not persnickety.
About what counts and what doesn't.
It's got to count. Yeah, it's got to count. And then The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, of course. If you've been putting this one off on your TBR for a decade or so, since the early 2000s, you can check this one out. This setting is very much like Venice inspired, like Mediterranean vibes. So lots of bodies tossed under the docks, So
body floating by the docks.
Yeah, a lot of bodies found floating by the docks.
I guess the blade itself counts then, because there are docks. The coast does not feature
maybe in the second book when they're in Dagosca, that might count. I don't know. Who knows? Anyway,
I don't think that's on the coast. Anyway,
me neither.
Read one of these books.
Read one of those books.
Druids is the next category, Charles. That was hard for me.
This is a tough one. One of my least favorite categories, if I'm being honest. I was like,
I do believe you can replace one category.
Yeah,
I do believe you can replace one category.
I mean, the read-along category is challenging too. I would be considered replacing that as well. It's between the read-along and this one for like worst category. You want to give our fantasy a little, like, fill that bag up, like promote your read-along stuff. Like, I'm not going to begrudge you that, but druids though. A book that heavily features druids. This is going to be a classic druid, a priest or magician in Celtic lore, or magic user whose power stems from nature. Okay, so that kind of broadens it up a little bit. And they specifically said not the Iron Druid Chronicles by Kevin Hearn, which is, if you Google fantasy druid books, his is the only one that comes up. So a little bit of a challenge. But there is some books in the Shannara series that are pretty popular, that have a druid, but in their world, druids is a word used for like sorcerer. But I mean, it says whose powers stem from nature, so it kind of qualifies. So if you want to read a Terry Brooks novel, you can check those out.
Once nature is in the mix.
Yeah, once nature's in the mix. And that brings me to Uprooted by Naomi Novak. And I in the notes, I didn't list it as a recommendation. I pretty much just asked the question, does Uprooted by Naomi Novak count? Dylan, what do you think? Nature's in the
I
mix.
haven't read
big time.
Uprooted.
Oh, you haven't read Uprooted with the dragon and all that? I thought you read that.
No. I know the first line though.
Okay, yeah. So
it's a famous first line.
It is.
Anyway,
I did read it, and it is very nature-based magic. So that's why I'm willing to count it. And let's move on from that category. We got 2 left here. We got to keep this under an hour 30. Featuring robots. Read a book that features robots, androids, clockwork machines, or automatons. And the hard mode is robot is like the protagonist. I have no idea, but
remember that?
No
Hugo?
Idea. I remember the story in the movie, yeah.
Chloe Grace Moretz was in it?
Yeah.
CGM,
of course.
Also in another robot-centric
CGM is in the mix, of course. You got
it counts.
It counts. But, I mean, the obvious one here is All Systems Red by Martha Wells, right? Like, that's the robot is the protagonist.
Is Murder by a Robot? No. Yes. Obviously, not the time to get persnickety about that. I'd say it counts.
To me,
really funny. Also really fits for novella.
Is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. Does it qualify for hard mode? I don't know. That's part of the story. Big fan of that one. Great title as well. The inspiration for the Blade Runner movie. One of my huge pet peeves in a bookstore is when they have a version of this book that they call it Blade Runner. Like they have Blade Runners in huge text, and then it's like, and then it's just some kind of weird thing like, it's really called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick. And so that annoys me, especially when the title's so beautiful. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. My favorite title. It's one of mine too. It's like so good. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy has a character in it who's voiced in the movie by Severus Snape. Features a main robot in the story. And then, Dylan, this is yours.
People don't say Severus enough.
People don't say, but when Severus is in the mix, you got to say the full name.
Is in the mix. All right, the next one I recommend is Autonomous by Emily Newitz. That is a fantastic book that dives into some territory around robots and their humanity that I've not seen, or their like potential sentience / quote unquote humanity that I've not seen in other works. And it's a newer one and cutting edge, I would say.
Oh yeah, that sounds exciting. I love that. And to me, I love these more philosophical human condition kind of themes applied to science fiction. And like, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? It's like, hey, when an android can mimic a human so closely that you can't tell the difference, does it even matter anymore if they're quote human or not? It's an interesting question, and like why we still may have these biases or fears or prejudice against androids that maybe they dream of electric sheep, maybe they dream of real sheep. Like, it's a good question. Who knows? And that brings us to the last category, which is just sequel. Read a book that is a sequel to another SFF book, hard mode, book 3 or on in the series. Pretty much all of these books that we recommended have sequels, and I know you got to kind of bounce around because you can't use the same author twice for the book for the bingo card, but maybe you read one of these years ago and are reminded of it.
You got to be in the middle of some
You're in the middle of
series.
something. I know. For us, we're always in the middle of something. We're finishing up Stormlight Archive and this and that, and tons of stuff that we could put.
We did finish up the available Stormlight Archive books.
We did.
Give us credit for that,
but
Charles.
We could put Rhythm of War in this
it took to get there.
In this block. We
did read this. We could put it here.
That
it would be interesting to take a look once we're done with the year.
Yeah.
If we
how close
accidentally finished a bingo, right?
I mean, looking at this, we got very close. There's a lot of these books we read in the past year.
This year,
yeah. So a lot of these we're pulling from what we talk about on the show. But there we go, guys. 25 categories, multiple recs. You can't go wrong with any of these. What did you guys pick? Are you going to play along? Let us know. But Dylan, I think for the sake of time, there's nothing left to do but to say thank you to our fantasy for putting together such a fun idea, and then to play that sweet, sweet outro music.
Yeah. And also, I'm going to one last time beg you to post this on Reddit because I'm not allowed to.
Well, there we go, guys.
But get the sweet, sweet outro music pumping, Charles.
All right, let's do that. Here we go. thank you, everyone, one and all, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. If you like what you heard today and you want to support the show, reach out to us, talk more about some of these recs, some of the problematic things we've touched on, some of the exciting things we've touched on.
Don't hit me up about Piers
No, don't
Anthony,
do that.
please.
We don't want that associated with our account, but you never know. That's over. That's over on the FTF Podcast on Instagram and the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end on Twitter. No Reddit handle, but you can just...
Yes, we do.
We do, actually. What is it? It's the FTF Podcast?
I think it's just at the FTF Podcast.
Yeah, so...
You, the FTF Podcast. I swear I understand how Reddit works.
So knowledgeable on Reddit. But anyway, Dylan, if they reach out to us on social media, we talk about all these great book recs, this wonderful book bingo challenge that our fantasies put together, and then they want to support the show even more, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast, which you can do over on Spotify now. It's just 2 clicks over on the top of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast feed, and it means so much to us when you do that. It also means so much to us when you write a review and or just rate on Apple Podcasts. That is something that always puts a smile on my face and presumably on Charles's face as well. But just listening is more than enough. Thank you so much for doing that.
Just listening, guys, you presumed correctly, Dylan, is more than enough. Thank you all so much for listening. You guys are awesome. Appreciate you making it all the way to the end. Thank you. And as always, guys, go forth and conquer, friends.
And post on Reddit.
Post on Reddit, please.